has been defined so that you're helping the students achieve knowledge or skills that leads them to achieve a learning outcome. So the key here is I talk about learning by using, not learning by doing. So often active learning is talked about in terms of learning by doing. I want to focus on a goal. You're having them use information you've given in order to achieve a particular learning outcome, to achieve knowledge or skills that you specified in advance. So it's very top down. Active learning is more effective than traditional lectures. Don't just take my word for it. This is a classic meta-analysis published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Let me just read this to you. This is a quote from there I think is really worth considering. The studies analyzed here document that active learning leads to increases in examination performance that would raise average grades by half a letter, and that failure rates under traditional lecturing increased by 55% over the rates observed under active learning. Finally, the data suggests that STEM, that's science, technology, engineering, math, instructors may begin to question the continued use of traditional lecturing in everyday practice, especially in light of recent work indicating that active learning confers disproportionate benefits for STEM students from disadvantaged backgrounds and for female students in male-dominated fields. So that was a meta-analysis. Over 200 studies were examined. Big effect. Clearly, without question, active learning is effective. Why is it effective? It's because of how the brain works. The science of learning underlies active learning. So an enormous amount is now known about how learning and memory work. So learning consists of encoding, which is taking information in, and storage, that is integrating information into what you already know. So that's what I mean by learning. Memory consists of retention, that is preserving information over time, and retrieval, that is digging information out when it's needed. So learning and memory are different sides of the same coin. Without learning, you can't have memory. And if you don't have memory, the learning really didn't take place. So it's about getting the information in, integrating it to what you know, learning, and then hanging on to it over time and being able to get it out when you need it, memory. So there's a huge amount known about learning and memory now, thousands and thousands of published studies. Very little of that information is systematically used in education, mostly for historical reasons, but it can be. So I'm going to talk today about how we can use what is known from the science of learning. We can use it to help students learn. The principles that I'm going to talk about are based on large literatures. They capture highly replicable phenomena, large effect sizes. I wasn't interested in something that's just p less than 0.05 and a small effect size. Very general. These principles can help humans learn anything. So there's two groups of principles. The first I categorize under the general title of pay attention and think it through. So there are variations of this category. The second, create appropriate mental connections. We'll go through two examples of principles from each of these. Let's start with the category pay attention and think it through. So there are two principles, deep processing and deliberate practice. I'm going to start with deep processing. Let's start with a demo. Not good pedagogy to have people sit too long passively, so let's have you do something. This demo will illustrate a very general principle. Here's what's going to happen. You'll soon see a list of words. Each word has in green the word living before it, or the word height in blue before it, in parentheses. If you see living, please decide whether the word that comes right after it names a living thing. So for example, if it was living and then tree, you'd say yes, tree is living. A rock, you'd say no. Okay. On the other hand, if you see height, please decide whether the word as it's printed in front of you has a taller letter, that is a higher ascender, at the beginning and at the end. So look at the word house as it's printed here. The H ascends taller than the E, so the answer is yes. But mouse, the M does not ascend taller. They're the same size as the E, so this is no. And most, the T is actually taller than the M, so this is also no. So to be clear, let's go through these samples. All right, you tell me. So would this be yes or no, first one? You please answer loud.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
What about the next one? Thank you. Next one. Is this yes or no?
No.
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 Okay, what next one?
Yes.
Mm,
Yes.
Yes.
No.
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 Professor Kosslyn, you're on mute.
Welcome to Zoom. My apologies. Yeah. Okay. So I don't know where it cut off. The task is to go through each word based on what you see, make the judgment. So please make the indicated judgment for each word and do this silently. Don't write anything down, please. Click the thumbs up reaction in Zoom when you're finished so I'll know when people have gone through the list. Oh, I have a question here. Yes, please. There's one question. Go ahead. Oh, the hand is unraised. All right. Any questions at all? Let's go through it. Okay.
Yeah.
Please. I'm sorry. Did you have a question?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, let's go through it then.
Could you please repeat the instructions because they were lost in between?
Okay, so the instructions are go through a list of words, living or height in front of it. If you see living, please decide whether the word names a living thing. If you see height, please decide whether the word as it's printed has a taller letter that is a higher ascender at the beginning than at the end. So H is taller than E, M is not taller than E, M is not taller than T. In fact, T is taller, so these are no. Okay, so there's the examples. Please give me the thumbs up when you're done so I'll know when people have gone through the list. Let us start. Go ahead. Thank you. Okay, you could Click a reaction when you're finished the list. Okay. Has everybody gone through the list now? All right. Now, please recall as many words you can that were on the list. You can write these down if you want. I'll give you 10 or 15 seconds to do that, please. All right. Now, I'm going to show you the words again. Look at the words again. Count how many words you correctly recalled following each type of judgment. This is the honor system. We're not going to be grading or anything. Just want to know how many did you recall. So score yourself. So please go through this. How many of these words in each list did you recall? All right. Finally, please notice whether you recall more words that you had judged in terms of living, non-living, or more words that you had judged in terms of relative height of the first letter. So here's a poll. Can we launch the poll now, please? So let's find out how many people recalled more words. So look what's happening here. You all see this? So, okay, that's great. All right, let us share the results. And now let us go back to screen share. Thank you. So what you saw, typical result, most people recall more words that they had judged in terms of living, non-living, than they had judged in terms of higher, non-higher. Now this, if I had done the experiment right, by the way, I would have had two groups where words for one group that were judged living, non-living would have been judged for height for the other group, and vice versa, because there are individual differences in how memorable a given word is for a given person. So the reason that some people actually did remember more following higher, non-higher probably had more to do with the particular words that happen to be in that category. By doing what's called counterbalancing, by having the words occur equally often over people in each judgment type, we can get rid of those kind of biases. But for this kind of demo, it's pretty compelling. What you saw is a typical result. More people recall more words, even though you didn't try to remember them. Just by making the judgment, living, non-living, you end up remembering the words better in general than if you judge relative height. Why? Judging whether a word names a living thing requires more mental processing than judging surface properties. You have to go in your memory, decide whether it's an animal, whether it moves, whether it's plants got green things. You have to dig information out. There's more mental steps where to decide whether it's living or non-living. Whereas if you're just given it and you judge what's in front of you, less processing. Point of the demo. It's not about memorizing lists of words. It's not what I was showing you. This demo illustrates a very general principle which affects all learning. I call it the principle of deep processing. The principle of deep processing. The more mental processing one performs an information, the more likely one is to retain it. So think about this. At the end of the day, can you recall the events of the day? If you're laying there in bed, can you think back about what happened during the day? Most people, virtually everyone says they can. All right. How much of what you recall did you intentionally try to memorize at the time it occurred? So I've done this many, many times now. And the typical result is somewhere between 5 and 10% of what people report. That is, only about 5 to 10% of what people recall at the end of the day did they intentionally try to remember at the time it was occurring. The vast majority of what is remembered is a byproduct. It's a byproduct of paying attention and thinking through the information or event. Just focusing in and paying attention is very likely to lead to remembering it later. That's amazing. So there have been many, many studies of this. The important thing is what you pay attention to is what you're likely to remember. So in one study, they had them focus on the meaning of words versus sounds, and then later tested meaning or sound. It turns out what you pay attention to is what you're likely to remember, even with something like a word. Active learning exercises should direct learners to focus on what they need to know to achieve learning outcomes. This is the critical thing. You've got to focus their attention on what they need to know to get to your goal. You have to have a learning goal in mind to begin with, and then you give them information to help them achieve that goal. So let me give you an example of a technique to induce deep processing of material that underlies a learning objective. So a learning objective is what you as a faculty person or course designer would set up that you want the students to achieve. The learning outcome of what they actually did achieve. In the ideal world, they're the same. So this was for actually an actual course in economics where they wanted students to be able to identify effects of fiscal expansion. So what we did is had them do a debate. So they debated in the current US context, the best policy is to aim for the largest possible fiscal expansion to ensure that the recovery gets and remains on track. That's their learning objective. So what we did is 3 phases. In the first phase, there are 4-person breakout groups, did it in Zoom, so breakout rooms. They prepared a debate. So they know what the proposition is. There are 2 types of groups. One type prepares to argue for the pro case and one for the con. This works for all kinds of debates, not just this particular one. After 10 minutes, new 4-person groups form that include 2 representatives from the pro and 2 from the con groups. That's why it's called a jigsaw. The first set of groups are broken up and reassembled. So there's 4 people are all preparing for the pro, or they're all preparing for the con. Second phase, we break those up. We now have 2 and 2, and we have in the debate, and note the strongest and weakest arguments to the other side. And then the class comes together, and each person summarizes the strongest and weakest arguments. They write a little thing, which are them, some of them are pulled up and read to the class as a whole. So the key here is there are incentives and consequences that lead learners to focus on material that underlies the learning objective. So the idea is we want them to focus on what's important for the learning objective. And the way we do that is with incentives and consequences. So let's go through this again. In the first phase, they know that they're going to have to represent their group, the pro or the con, in the second phase. And they don't want to be embarrassed. Very powerful motivation. They don't want to be embarrassed. So in the second phase, they now are debating and they have to note the strongest and weakest arguments. They know that they're going to have to report that, and they may be called on in that final phase. So in each phase, there are incentives to pay attention. That's what this is about. Incentives to pay attention and process deeply the information that underlies the learning objective. So being motivated to prepare for and conduct a debate induces deep processing material that helps learners achieve learning outcome. So you need to, there's I wrote a little book on active learning. In the last chapter, I have over 50 different types of activities. A debate is only one of them. All the activities have in common that they focus the students in and leave them process deeply and do other kinds of things, which we'll talk about in a minute, the material they need to learn. So principle of deep processing. Get them to focus, think deeply about the relevant information. Now let's go to a second principle, deliberate practice. This is another variation of this general category of paying attention to and thinking about material. The principle of deliberate practice is learning is enhanced by using feedback to focus on practicing the most challenging aspects of a task. So practice is where you do something over and over again. That's not as effective as deliberate practice, where you pick out what's hardest for you and focus in on that. Practice that particular part. So use feedback to identify what aspects of a task are most difficult for you and work on those aspects. So typical examples, learning a language with a tutor. So when I lived for a year in Paris and taught in French, and I had to learn the language well enough to do that. And so I hired a tutor. And what I would do is I would say a word. Pronunciation was very difficult for me. So I'd say a word. She would listen and then say it back the way it should sound. And I would listen for the delta, the difference between what I had said and what she had said. And I'd focus just on those subtle differences, like the way the R was pronounced. That's an example of deliberate practice. Any kind of apprenticeship relationship, like in the trades, working with a golf coach. These are all examples of where you'll be given feedback to help you identify what you're having the most trouble with, so you can focus on practicing that particular part. Music is a good example. The challenge, using deliberate practice on scale, online on scale. It's fine to do it one-on-one, it just doesn't scale well. So in any kind of teaching where you've got a group, you're not going to have one-on-one. How do you use deliberate practice? So Benjamin Franklin, who was one of the greatest American scientists ever, invented lots of different things, including bifocals and various things. But one of the things he did is he taught himself how to write. And he's independently invented a variation of deliberate practice. Here's what he did. He would notice an article he had read that he particularly liked. And then a couple of days later, he'd try to write it down, paraphrasing it in his own words. And then he'd take what he had written and compared it to the original. And he would notice the differences and use that as feedback to help him get better at writing. And it worked, it got quite good. So here's an example of how you can do the Benjamin Franklin technique at scale. The learning objective here, what we want students to learn in this example, is to produce clear and cogent memos. So the instructor would describe the characteristics of a good memo. For example, they're concise. They have all the necessary information, but no extraneous information, things like that. Breakout groups, you now put them into small groups, would write a memo, for example, to request funding for a speaker series. Then breakout groups will receive an example, it's like Franklin, of a good memo on another topic. So they have to abstract out the principles. Deep processing. So now they're using deep processing on top of this idea of deliberate practice. So you're getting two different learning principles at work here. So another topic, they notice characteristics, and then they identify ways to improve their own. So this is a deep processing, deliberate practice first example. This is like what Franklin did. Then breakout groups revise their memos based on this initial feedback. And then we pair the groups and we use a rubric to help them evaluate their memos to get a second layer of deliberate practice. So here's an example of a rubric. A rubric can be used to grade people. So if they do none of the following, clearly stated reason for the memo, concrete specific language, all the necessary information, no extraneous information, based on logic, not emotion. If they did none of these, they would get a 0. or sorry, a 1. If they did only one of the following, they get a 2. If they did 2, any of these 2, they get a 3. 3, and so forth. So these kind of rubrics are used to grade people in a way to have them be relatively objective, so be consistent. So you give a rubric now to both groups, and you have them essentially grade each other's memos and use the rubrics as feedback. So the challenge to use deliberate practice, where you focus in on what's hardest and drill down and practice on that, how to do it at scale. The solution is to use models and rubrics via peer feedback. Okay, now we're going to take a pause. You will next get to use these concepts and methods in a breakout group. Before we go into the groups, do you have any questions? We take 5 minutes to do a little active learning here. Any questions about either deep processing or about deliberate practice? Any questions about what concepts are? So I'm going to ask you to apply these concepts to something you have taught. So the key idea of deep processing is to have them do something that leads them to focus on what's important, what they need to learn. The key idea of deliberate practice, what is it? I've forgotten. Can anybody remind me? What's the key idea of deliberate practice?
Can I just answer? Using feedback to improve an area.
I'm having trouble hearing. Can someone please speak up? What's the key idea behind deliberate practice?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Using feedback to improve the contents of your work.
That is right, but the way you use feedback is you use the feedback to identify what's particularly difficult for you. So for example, if you're learning a piano piece, when you hit a rough patch, you'll go over and over again that rough patch. That's deliberate practice. You're focusing on what's hardest. You're not just doing the whole thing over and over again. Okay, any other questions? Any questions about deep processing or deliberate practice?
Are you saying that deep processing is to motivate the students to learn the topic?
So deep processing is a way to get them to learn it. So you motivate them to get them to pay attention and process it deeply.
Okay.
Because they know if they don't, they're going to be embarrassed. So for example, I'm going to call on some of you to say what happens in this breakout group after you're done. So I'm hoping that in the groups, we're going to use the principle of deep processing, or the principle of deliberate practice. And what I want you to do is show how one of these principles, pick one of them, can be applied effectively to teach a subject of interest to the group. So you're going to be in a group of 4 or 5 people. I'd like you to pick a subject and then think about how you could use either the principle of deep processing, that is, get them to pay attention and think through deeply, use the information, learning by using, or the principle of deliberate practice. Okay, and then we're going to come back and I'm going to call on 1 or 2 of you to say what you came up with. So I'm hoping you're going to actually learn this because I'm having you use the information. So any questions before we go into the groups?
So the
If not,
group gets to choose, I
Yes.
was asking does the group get to choose which one we want to focus on?
Yes.
Okay.
You choose a subject that you would teach and choose one of the 2 principles, or both if you want, and think of a way to use that principle to help teach something in particular in that subject that you've chosen. Okay?
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Sure. All right. If we could have the breakout groups, please, for 5 minutes. Is everyone back yet?
Yep, we are back.
Yeah. Everyone
Okay, excellent. All right. So do we have a volunteer Who would
Yeah,
tell us,
group one, I would like to volunteer.
please?
So our group in the limited time available took at the second aspect, and we said that suppose the task given is to make a good technical presentation. So the way we will do it is we give them a topic, and then we also give them a sample good presentation made by an expert. We ask them to then look at the places where they were different from the expert, what points they did not incorporate. Then they will modify their presentation to incorporate those changes, and then again they will present it. So this way they will learn from where they were different. So this is coming under deliberate practice.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Thank you. Anybody else want to
Yeah,
volunteer?
Dr.
Please.
Miss Kalyapan can present what our group thought about.
Okay,
Miss Kalyapan.
Yes, yeah. Good evening all. We discussed about the climate
please.
and the unseasonal weather that is showing up everywhere. Like for example, in Mumbai, we had the unseasonal rains. So we thought that this is because of the climate change and because of the pollutants that is being sent up in the air by the industries which are coming up. So
So how did you teach them? What principle did you use?
So we applied both the pro and the
Yeah.
con, and we
Ah.
discussed that human warming
Got it.
human action was the cause of these climate changes, and we compared examples across the world,
Perfect.
including Europe and in the United States. And then we also presented the con that roughly about 95% of the scientists felt that human action was the cause of global warming,
Right.
but there are still 5% or less of the scientists who believe it's a natural phenomenon that occurs every couple of 100 years.
So this is a good example of deep processing. So you have them digging deep, doing lots of mental processing, thinking about pros and cons, which is going to lead them to remember the material. That's great. Okay, you got a flavor. Obviously 5 minutes was not enough, but you got a flavor for how you can use these two principles. You can design activities that'll lead them to think it through, either processing deeply and or at identifying what they need to drill deeply on and use deliberate practice. Let's quickly go through the other category, because the science of learning is not just about paying attention and thinking it through. There are a set of principles that fall into that category, but also the second category, which is create appropriate mental connections. So let me quickly go through two of these principles, chunking and associations. Let's do chunking first. Let me start with the demo. Okay, you will soon see a series of letters. Please try to memorize each letter in order. Okay, now I'm telling you, try to memorize. Okay, how many letters can you recall? Score yourself. If you recalled
XX,
more,
IBM, CBS.
okay, if you recalled more than 9 letters, did you notice the groupings? Did you?
Yes.
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 Okay. Did anybody recall more than 9 that did not notice the groupings? All right, now everybody look for 3-letter acronyms of famous organizations. 3-letter groups that name famous organizations. Look for them. Okay, now how many letters can you recall?
All of them.
All of them.
16.
This is called chunking. If you try to remember the letters individually, it's way more than you can hold in your so-called working memory. You can only hold 3 or 4 things at once in consciousness and working memory. But the things are groups. They can be groups, which are called chunks. Chunk is a group. So here, I've chunked them using physical properties, which I'll talk about in a minute. But you can see 4 things. As soon as you organize them, you can recall a lot more. Principle of chunking. Learning is easier when material is organized into 3 or 4 organized units. Here's the trick though, each of which can itself contain 3 or 4 units. That's the power of chunking. It's hierarchical. Chunking is important because it minimizes cognitive load. We can only hold about 3 or 4 things in our consciousness, in our working memories. So, and you can't do anything with information that's not conscious in terms of modifying it or analyzing it in some way. So to minimize cognitive load, never require learners to process more than 4 chunks. And how do you define a chunk? For perceptual things, like what we just looked at, you can use a set of laws that have been defined over the last century or so, perceptual grouping laws. They're called the Gestalt laws of organization. So I call these laws the birds of a feather rule. Let me give you the two most important. Similarity, you saw both of these in the example with the IBM. You see here 2 groups, 4 black X's, 4 red O's. You don't see separate letters, you see 2 groups. Notice below, same number of X's and O's, but now you see 4 groups, 2 X's, 2 O's, 2 X's, 2 O's, based on similarity. Similar things get grouped together. Another principle is proximity. You don't see 8 separate letters, you see a group of 4, another group of 4. Down here, same number of letters, now you see 4 groups, 2, 2, 2, and 2. This principle, these principles, similarity and proximity, the birds of a feather rule will work with anything, including birds. So for example, here we see 2 groups based on similarity of size and shape. Here we see 2 groups above, 3 groups, same number of birds, just how they're organized. It's the number of groups that is crucial for what people can store in working memory. Here's a beautiful example of hierarchical chunking, which is the real power. This was the Boston Symphony Orchestra showing you who's playing what instrument. When you first look at this, you see 3 big wedges based on similarity and proximity. 3 big wedges. Within each wedge, it's suborganized. So here you see the first violins, they're near each other. There's a space here. So we have proximity grouping the first and second violins as subgroups. Over here, you've got similarity of shape and size grouping the double basses, cellos. Notice the proximity here, violas. There's another law I didn't tell you about with symmetry, which is working here. So these get grouped, the woodwinds into a group and so forth. So the key is you can pack an enormous amount of information in if you use hierarchical chunking. Chunking is not just for visual materials. It's not just spatial, it also occurs over time. So for example, in one study, they taught a student, student learned how to organize digits so he could memorize 79 random digits, 1 per second, by organizing them hierarchically over time. He was a long distance runner and he organized the digits into times of segments of races he had run and organized those into bigger segments and so on. One way to chunk lesson plans. So if you already you want to use active learning, you've already got a lecture, you got to figure out where you can put the active learning, where you can put a debate, where you can put problem solving, you put role playing, any of these kinds of things that get people to process deeply and so forth. So one way you can do that is you can identify where in a lecture each exam question was answered. So you've got lectures, let's say we're just going to use exams to assess them. Look back in your lectures and identify where an exam question was answered. Group conceptual chunks via similarity and proximity. Similarity in ideas and near in time. So you'll discover that there are conceptual chunks that underlie what they need to know to answer an exam question. So go through and identify those. And anything you didn't ask a question about, you probably didn't think were that important. So you can eliminate it and insert active learning exercises after chunks. So this is one way to be able to figure out what's important and use active learning to help them really learn it. You probably noticed until that breakout group, you really hadn't really understood what deep processing and deliberate practice are about. It isn't until you actually use the information that you really learn it. So you can lecture, but they're not going to absorb anywhere near as much as they will if they actually use the information. There's a huge literature on this. One way to do this is in terms of what I call the learning sandwich. A front-loaded learning sandwich is what I'm doing here. The instructor gives a brief lecture, addresses a specific learning objective. So for example, what I did initially is I had learning objectives where I wanted to give you a sense of what the principle of deep processing and the principle of deliberate practice were about. So that was the first phase here. And then I had you engage in active learning, doing an activity that uses information from the lecture. And then we debriefed. So this is a typical front-loaded learning sandwich where you give them information up front. They're not going to really learn it until they do something with it, they use it, and then debrief. That's part of the motivation, to make sure they know the debrief's coming, so they'll pay attention and do the activity. That's front-loaded. You can also do back-loaded. So an example of this is a technique that the physicist Eric Mazur at Harvard developed. He calls peer instruction. Let me give you an example really quickly, because he's teaching kinematics. He says, okay, at the very beginning, he gives them a puzzle, problem, or an issue. He says, imagine we have a meter by meter sheet of iron. We now take out a circle in the center. We pop it out. So now it's got a hole in the middle, maybe, I don't know, 12 centimeters across something. We heat the entire thing so it's red hot, uniformly. That's key, it's uniformly. Not melting, red hot. Here's the question. Would that hole get larger after it's been heated, get smaller after it's been heated, or stay the same size? So what Eric does is he has people use clickers to vote at the beginning. Then he puts them into breakout groups. He does this in lectures. He has people near each other discuss the problem for about 5 minutes. And teaching assistants go around and give hints. So what do you think? Would it get larger, smaller, or stay the same size? What do you think? How many people think it would get larger? Could you say yes? Okay, how many people think it's smaller?
No.
It will remain the same.
Or remain the same. Okay, so has them struggle with it, and there have been studies published on this. Then has them do a poll at the again, same thing. Ask them larger, smaller, say the same. People get better, even if no one got it right when they went into the group. At the end of the group, a significant number have now gotten it right just by discussing it and working it through. The key here, by the way, was the hint that it's uniformly heated. Your intuition is probably when you heat it up, you get more kinetic energy in the molecules, they start pushing against each other. People have that intuition. Where they break down is some people think like the four corners will expand and push it in. What they don't get is the molecules right around the center of that hole have the same energy as everybody else. So you'd need additional energy above and beyond that to push them in, to overcome their trying to push out. So in fact, it expands out. Okay. So at the end of a backloaded learning sandwich, the whole class is debriefed. And notice what's going on during this engagement in the middle. Deep processing, delivered practice. Okay. So debriefs. So this idea of learning sandwich is a way to organize an entire class. So what I do is I have a series of these. I've chunked it. This is about chunking. I've chunked the class into a set of learning sandwiches, each of which is also chunked in a set of units. So the first one might be a backloaded one. That is, I'd frame a problem, do a poll, then I have single-phase breakout groups, and then a debrief, poll, and lecture, reveal, explain to it. Then I do a learning sandwich front-loaded, a lecture and a video, a two-phase jigsaw breakout, maybe a debate, and then a debrief, question and answer, and so forth. So I've used chunking to organize the course as a whole into units. And then within each unit, I have a set of classes, and each class is then chunked in terms of learning sandwiches. Okay, last principle, quickly. Associations is another example of connections. So here's a study that was done. They read participants in the study a passage like this. Procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It's important not to overdo any particular endeavor. That is, better to do too few things at once than too many, blah, blah, blah. It goes on. They're asked to memorize this. One group is told this is about washing clothes. Another group's not given any label. The group that gets this when they know it's about washing clothes remembers about twice as much as the group that's told nothing. Why? Because the principle of associations. Learning is enhanced by associating new information to what's already known. Okay, this is about mental connections. So you actually use associations in learning memory in three ways. You've seen one already in encoding. Remember, that's part of learning, getting it in. So you can use associations in chunking. That's what you did when you looked at IBM, CIA, and all that. You used associations to organize it. Second one is storing information effectively by integrating it into prior knowledge. That's what the watch and close thing shows. The last one is to be able to retrieve the information out. I'm going to just skip over that because we don't have time. So you want to use associations in active learning. Principles of active learning are most effective when combinations are used. So I've illustrated that a couple times with deliberate practice, pointing out that they were doing deep processing when they were having to abstract out the principles from a model memo in a different topic. So they had to deep process when they were doing deliberate practice. But there are ways to use the principles by games. So this is another kind of active learning. I just wanted to illustrate it. So this was for a medical school where they were teaching students to organize anatomical systems. So it's a kind of bingo, it's a game. Learners get a matrix of names of body structures. So it's a matrix with words in each one, in each cell. They then are shown a series of slides for 2 seconds each, illustrating a picture of a body structure with a name under it. Learners cross off the name of another structure that's part of the same overarching system. So for example, if they see a picture of a tongue, the word tongue on it, they might cross off stomach because they're both part of the digestive system. As soon as they have a row, column, or diagonal checked off in their matrix, they shout bingo. They win. At the end of the game, they turn in their matrices and receive feedback about their accuracy. So look what's going on. Deep processing. Learners must deeply process the relevant memories, the anatomical systems. Chunking. They learn to organize parts into systems. Building associations. Learners strengthen the association between the names and illustrations presented part and related parts they learned previously. Deliberate practice. They receive feedback at the end of the exercise, which alerts learners to which systems they need to study in greater depth. So you can use this active learning in lots and lots of different ways. What they have in common is they draw on these underlying principles in the science of learning. So we had 4 principles here. So let's stop. First principle was deep processing. Can you tell me what it was? What is deep processing about? Somebody volunteer?
Making people find associations in what they learn.
That's one way to do deep processing. But the key to it is, anybody else want to elaborate?
You
Learn by
recall
using-
from your memory. Hello, sorry.
Go
That's
ahead.
right.
Memory.
That's right. Have them engage in more mental processing, any mental processing. You're going to remember much better if you pay attention and think it through. More mental operations, like you did in that demo of having to decide if it's living or non-living. The more operations you do mentally, the more likely you are to remember it later. All right, deliberate practice. What's that about?
You practice to remember things.
But not just doing it over and over again. It's deliberate.
Particularly
practice what is difficult for you when you
Right. So both of those involve paying attention and thinking it through. So deep processing, you want to focus on what's important and do mental operations. Deliberate practice, focus on what's hardest. Process that. Okay, those two fell under that big category, Pay attention, think it through. Next category, connections. So what was chunking about?
Grouping the information into different chunks, so making it different groups.
Right, no more than 3 or 4, but they can be hierarchical. Each group can be grouped itself. Okay,
Yeah.
last, associations. You want, what is associations about? You want them to,
Yeah, associate with some kind of previous knowledge. So some association you do find, and then it can be based on some similarity, contiguity, etc. So
okay,
a lot many factors
okay.
play a role.
Okay, so I hope I gave you a sense of what these principles from the science of learning look like. Great, sounds like you got what I was trying to do, my learning objectives. I've written a tiny little book where I go through 5 of these principles with lots and lots of examples about how to apply them in actual teaching. But I think I've given you a sense that the cognitive science literature actually has a lot of information that can be used constructively in teaching to help students learn. Okay, any questions? I'm happy to spend more time. I know we run out of official time,
So I
but
have
if
a
anyone
question
wants to
regarding
stay.
regarding chunking. So the example that you showed, there were chunks which could be easily identified, like the KGB and CIA, etc. What if there are absolutely random information with no association possible?
Then you can still use physical grouping by pausing if you're saying it over time, or proximity in space, or similarity like color and so on. So you can use chunking even if it's completely random. It's obviously more effective if you can also have them integrated into what they already know. So you use both chunking and associations. But chunking can be used with anything by using principles like proximity and similarity.
I have a question.
Please.
How is this different from learning by doing? At the beginning,
Good question. So learning by doing includes things like exploratory learning or discovery learning, where you have, or just a general discussion. So a general discussion without having a goal is learning, supposedly learning by doing, hoping that they'll stumble on useful insights. Learning by using is where you in advance have a goal of something you want them to learn, the so-called learning objective. And you've designed the activity to help them use information to achieve that learning outcome. So it's different. The learning by using is very top down. It's very engineered. You've designed the activity with a goal in mind. Learning by doing is a broader category that includes exploratory things that don't have a particular goal.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Other questions?
So I have a question. Can these principles be applied to any kind of teaching, or it's limited to only some specific kinds of teaching?
It can be applied to anything at all. Any subject matter. It's actually quite agnostic about subject matter. Science of learning is about form, not content. So for any content at all, you can have them do an activity where they have to deeply process. You can have them do an activity where they identify what's the hardest thing, and do deliberate practice, practicing the hardest parts. You can have them organize it by chunking, have that integrate into what they already know by associations and so forth. There are other principles I haven't talked about, but it applies to absolutely anything. It's all about thinking of the activities. It's all about, you have to have learning objectives. So provided you have learning objectives, you can any content at all.
I have a question. So does it, how do you scale it for a large class?
Yeah.
I mean, I can think of doing this for a smaller group.
Great question. Excellent question. So that's what those learning sandwiches are really about. So you can divide up the content delivery component of a class, like what I'm doing right this second, and the actual learning components, which involve learning by using. So the content delivery, the lecture part, or video, can be done for 1,000 people as easily as for 10 people, right? They're just sitting there listening.
Yeah.
Then you have small breakout rooms. That's where the actual learning is going to occur, where you have them do an activity. So you can have a very large number of breakout groups, even in Zoom, but I think there's 150 they allow you to do. So if each had 4, that's a large number of people. So the trick is to combine the content delivery, very large number of people at once, with the small breakout rooms where they're doing the activities, and then combining them with rubrics so they can give each other feedback, so you can distribute the deliberate practice where the individual instructor doesn't need to go to every single group. By using rubrics, you have relatively objective standards that they can use for each other. So you can scale this beautifully. It scales very well. Online, by the way. So it's actually harder to do it in person. Eric Mazur has worked out like techniques where he has in-person students who are near each other in the lecture hall turn together and do the breakout groups. It works pretty well. It works pretty well, but it's actually easier to do the breakout part online.
I have a question, a follow-up question on what you just said. So when you do this, when we do this grouping, is it a random grouping or is it based on some academic performance of the students? Does it depend on that?
That is a really good question. Excellent, excellent question. The answer is it depends. So when I was at Minerva, where a lot of these techniques were developed, we started by using purely random assignment to breakout rooms. And we ran into a problem, which is for technical material, some students knew it pretty well and some didn't know it well at all. And the students who knew it well suddenly discovered they were acting as tutors for the others. And they didn't enjoy that. And the other students who didn't know it well didn't particularly like being tutored by their peers. So that was problematic. So what we started doing is using data on previous performance to assign students at different levels into the same group. And we designed the activities so they were multi-layered, so that students who were very good could drill deeper into the activity than students who didn't know the material as well, but all of them could still do it. And that worked beautifully. It worked really well. So it depends on whether the goal is to have them learn the material, in which case I advise having groups at the same level, or the goal is to have them apply material that was relatively easy to learn, in which case I think random is fine.
Can I just chip in, because we are IIT Gandhinagar is literally going to start in less than 2 weeks' time a mandatory course using active learning principles for teaching communications, written and verbal communications. As all of you who are university professors at IITs or BITS Pilani know, that students come to institutions like yours with varying degrees of proficiency in English. Some are highly proficient, some are average, and some are really deficient. So we face that dilemma, and between discussions with Active Learning Sciences, Stephen M.Kosslyn's group, and faculty members at IIT Gandhinagar, they decided that the breakout groups will comprise of people who have similar level of proficiency. And we'll let you know how they, after the lessons are given and the course is completed, how well this principle worked out. Thanks.
Thank you, Ron. If you think of any questions later, feel free to send me an email. I'd be happy to answer. My email address was on that initial slide. Let me screen share it again just for a second so you have it. So I appreciate your time and interest, especially all of you who've stayed over after official ending, and I hope this was useful to you. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much for a wonderful
Okay.
session.
Yeah,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Kosslyn, it was a very interesting lecture on active learning, and I'm sure everyone enjoyed it. So I'm sure you will get some questions through email later about this.
My pleasure. Okay, I wish you all well,
And thank you for taking out time to discuss and talk with us.
My pleasure, really.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.